Well, thank you all for being here today. I hope you've enjoyed the event and the speeches thus far. Can we get another round of applause for our tremendous... the energy of Carson, the articulation of Tyler, which is really unmatched. But as much as I love being behind the desk, this really is my favorite thing to do because it allows me to come out and see all of you wonderful people with your smiling faces, and it really does show what impact we actually do have, tangibly speaking, because when all is said and done, there's really not an effective difference between what we're doing here and what the talk radio programs of the 1980s were doing, perhaps the cable news programs of the 1990s were doing. The end result being, of course, we end up here on the college campus. But, of course, no appearance on the college campus would be complete without the appearance of the foot soldiers of the global libtard menace. We do not like these people. Now, Ty Cliffs has been nicknamed the Olive Branch. He's much more amicable with these people than I am, as indicated, of course, by my Sith red tie and his Jedi blue tie. So, these people, they write their little hit pieces, and they put up their little posters, they're name-calling us, they're anti-LGBT, like we're the weird ones, right? Like, they're out there like, yeah, our identity is centered around anal sex and genital mutilation. Those guys are the weird ones. We're the forgotten gamers of America, okay? We're normal. We like to play video games and but they can't help themselves. They are miserable people fundamentally. They are spiritually ill, and you can see it just by looking at them. They don't know God. They view life as nothing more than just the pursuit of pleasure. And so they do that to numb the pain of their own existence. And so when some young men come along, and they're more talented, they're better looking, smarter, more driven, they have no choice but to attack us. And they'll say it's because our ideas are basically just mean. You guys are mean, they're so hateful, we're so loving, and they're so hateful, they're just projecting all of that onto us. But you'll find out that if you actually ask them what we believe, they don't understand it, and they don't even know it. This can be proven, of course, empirically. We do have our sources for that. And that's more or less, I wrote here because they're bad word retarded, but that is true. I mean, fundamentally. They hate us because we're normal. They hate us because our existence in itself highlights their insecurities, and so, of course, they attack. And this puts me in a tough spot because I really did just want to make videos on the internet. I really just wanted to be at my desk, my little microphone, little Jesus bobblehead. But because of this, I have no choice but to internalize all of it and use it to fuel what everybody knows in this room, maybe they like it, they don't, is inevitable, which is the slow ascent to power. It's so true. Because we are returning to the mindset of our ancestors. The mindset that these people have tried so persistently to psychologically condition us into abandonment, which is very simply that we are for good and against evil. We're not liberals, we are illiberal. We do not believe in live and let live. Do what you want, man, because we know that evil is a cancer. It's a fire that, if not suppressed, will destroy your whole country. We thought that we could take communists at their word. Look where that got us. We thought the good and evil are just different points of view, man. And look where that got us. I would absolutely hope that what I'm saying is alarming because I'm trying to raise alarms. I'm trying to alarm people because this country is going to hell and we want to do something about that. Because if we don't, then no one else will. And that's why they call us extremists. It's a scary word because it makes people think of violence, despite the fact that virtually all political violence in this country is perpetrated by the left. But extremist literally just means that you are on the edge of the bell curve of aggregated American political opinion. You see how stupid the average person is, right? Outside, the average person. They're not very bright. They're not sending their best. How could you not be an extremist? I don't care about the pathetic, sort of feminine attempts to slander us. I only care about my country. And because of that, I'm obviously not interested in operating within the normal paradigm that has been established for what is acceptable to talk about during the most backwards time in global history. Why would you want to be normal in abnormal times? That doesn't make sense. And so that's why that established paradigm, which by the way, is the reason that we've lost virtually every political battle of the last century. That's why they like it. That's why these journalists, these activists who are good little servants to the establishment, that's why they like it. That's why they monitor the actions of 4 up-and-comers, people who are ascendant, intelligent young men who care about their country. But they don't write these articles about people like Matt Schlapp or Mark Levin, people who are household names more or less if you've been paying attention to right-wing politics for more than 5 years or so. And it's because they fear what we represent. Conservatives think that they want to win, right? Everybody in here wants to win. Show of hands, who wants to win? Can we do a little polling? We're so bad. Everyone wants to win. This is good. We need to work with this. They want to win, but because they're only used to losing, They're uncomfortable with what it will actually take to win, because the only thing they know, and therefore are comfortable with, is losing. And so we are actually the future of conservatism, because if there's going to be a future for this country, then it actually has to be conserved, and we're the only people who actually have the will to conserve it, because we will make America great again. But what does that mean? What does it mean to make America great again? That's the beauty of it. It really can't be defined. It's not something that can be exactly articulated, but nonetheless, it's something that we all know is true. This country is not what it used to be. But we still have in our possession the greatest resource in the history of the world, which is the American people. We can really build back better, can't we? We can make this country great again. And those American people, they've been sold out at every given opportunity by their own representation, by big business, by international finance, and now by their own neighbors and by their constituents. I mean, many people have realized that they can more or less capitalize on the well-meaning spirit of a desperate American people by selling them the most appealing product of all, which is hope. But this incompetent class of people have done nothing for us despite all the influence, all of the money, and all of the power that we've given to them. And so the difference between that class of people and the class of people composed of my cool friends and myself is that we're not only the ones who want to win, but we're the only ones who actually can win. And as we've collectively gone through even the last, 3 years of the American experience, I'm sure it's as clear to all of you as it is to myself and my cool friends that we are not on track to win. There is absolutely no trend that would suggest otherwise. And anyone who tells you the opposite is lying to you, or more likely trying to sell you something, which is actually particularly damaging and vicious if you do that within politics. Because if I'm trying to sell you a pen that doesn't work, or a pair of shoes that weren't actually in AOC's office, your life in the macro timeline is not probably altered that significantly. Whereas if I'm in the business of selling you hope, selling you false representation, false advocacy, I am occupying a volume that you require to be filled truthfully and competently in order to preserve a society that enables you and those you care about to actually flourish. And so that's why I'm much less concerned with those on the left and much more concerned with those who don't belong on the right, because it is imperative that we remember this. The only thing worse than the enemy is the traitor. These are very unfine people, folks, let me tell you. But despite that I've been, and I really like this, people call me the CEO of gatekeeping conservatism. I'm very proud of that, because I understand that political thought and political affiliation, it sort of evolves over time, with our education, with our experiences. And what's curious to me is that despite the societal entropy that we've all witnessed throughout the last several decades, and of course more specifically within the last few years, the approved paradigm of mainstream conservative dialogue has essentially been unwavering, with very few exceptions. And what's particularly tricky about conservatism is even the name sort of connotes this unwavering nature, that refusal or even inability to compromise or to deviate. However, the problem that we have yet, I think, to widely identify is that conservatism has cemented itself as something less about preserving ends through means and more about preserving the means in themselves for the sake of donors, for the sake of think tank, pseudo-intellectuals, and for the sake of those who ultimately seek the destruction of our nation, and for those who are irresponsibly and dangerously nostalgic for a time that just frankly no longer exists. And so this is to say that what is ironic about conservatism is that despite that it connotes those themes of steadfast allegiance to principles, that unwavering spirit that we mentioned, ultimately, if it is to be successful, it must actually be adapted to whichever elements of the traditional American society are the most vulnerable and under attack. This is because conservatism, properly defined, as we've said on the channel before, is simply just that which conserves the traditional American society. And so today what I'm asking you is this: what have we actually conserved in the last 70 years? We have failed to conserve the prospect of the American worker. We have failed to conserve the family unit. In fact, for every one conservative victory that you could name, we could list a dozen failures. And all of those victories would prove to have not actually stood the test of time. If we did this speech 3 years ago, you'd say, we got Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. Well, where that got us? Not very far. So would this not then necessitate a strategic reconfiguration? In what other operation could you so demonstrably and catastrophically fail without at least retreating back to the drawing board? You couldn't do this in athletic competitions, you couldn't do this in business, virtually anything else, all of which are unequivocally less important than the state and future of our country, because it is that state and future which makes all else possible. And there's a quote from Albert Einstein, which I think speaks to this quite well, but he's dead. I think he was a plagiarist too, so we're going to go with the more generationally appropriate Far Cry 3. We love Far Cry 3. There's a cutscene in Far Cry 3, of course, where the antagonist, Voss, laments the fact that every time he tries to kill you, you just end up surviving, you come back and try to fight him again. And so he has this monologue where he lays out what is the practical definition of insanity. And he says that is repeating the same action over and over and over again and expecting things to change. To do this would be insanity. And it's not like we're crazy, right? Like, we recognize the importance of God, we recognize the importance of human life, we recognize which bathroom we're supposed to be using, which athletic competitions in which we're supposed to be competing. There's no good reason for us to have lost so much ground in the last several decades, but nonetheless, due to a potent concoction of malevolence, incompetence, general malice, we have. And so given the state of our country right now, there's probably no better time, if we even have time at all, to address that our window is closing, and it's closing quickly. And once it closes, rest assured that it will not open again. It's going to be permanently locked. Because they asked us for free speech during the 1960s, during these social movements, because they didn't have representation, and we had the power. So they asked us for free speech, man. And we said, okay, because that was according to our principles. And now that they have the power, they remove us from all aspects of society and give us no chance to speak up, because that is according to their principles. So for us to successfully shift the paradigm in the competent direction, we must attack the required reading of the incompetent class. And so you might remember a couple years ago, supposedly Arizona went for Joe Biden. And prior to that, Arizona was a solid red state for 16 of the last 17 presidential elections in this country. The state that has the Latin for God and riches transcribed on their seal. We're supposed to believe they really felt compelled to turn out for Joe Biden and his coalition of atheists, pro-abortion, anti-religious freedom puppeteers. Do we believe that? Do we believe that?
No.
No, we don't believe that. Well, before Arizona was more or less Biden country, it produced a senator by the name of Barry Goldwater. And we're probably familiar with him. And Senator Goldwater had presidential ambitions which ultimately failed, but he's most remembered for having published a brief, ghost-written manifesto. It's kind of like a little passive-aggressive shot. It's ghost-written. I should even listen to it, right? It's called The Conscience of a Conservative, and this is considered to be the definitive work of the modern conservative movement. I'm sure many of us have read it. Many of us probably have a copy of it in our libraries. And even in the current printed hardcover version of the book, it describes itself ambitiously as the seminal work of modern conservatism. This, of course, begs the question, is it truly important for the seminal work of modern conservatism to have been written 60 years ago? Especially when factoring in how it is the ethos of the movement that was more or less born by that book that has caused our country to devolve into its current state. And ironically, it is in the foreword to this manifesto that he pushes back against the argument that conservatism is outdated just because it's old, by comparing it to hypothetical arguments that works by men such as Aristotle would be invalid simply because of their age. And this is correct. To label conservatism outdated simply because it's older perhaps, that would be redundant given that it seeks to conserve regardless of the passing of time. But the irony lies within the fact that it is precisely the emphasis on the principles in this manifesto which has crafted this particular strain of conservatism that has demonstrably failed to stand the test of time, and therefore is truly outdated. So allegiance to that which conserves the traditional American society can never be outdated, as it is a means to prioritize an elevated end, whereas allegiance to the means in themselves can be outdated, and in our case has proven to be outdated. Now, before we continue, I think it is important to clarify that we probably all agree with much of what Senator Goldwater outlines in this manifesto. We probably respect his legacy wholeheartedly. He paved the way for people like us, and so we have to exercise our humility in admitting that we're standing on his shoulders to a large degree. We're not arguing necessarily that the principles in the manifesto are in themselves wrong, but rather that it is the incessant and uniform emphasis on these principles in particular which has failed the conservative movement and, by extension, the American people. And so for those unfamiliar, if you explore the index of this manifesto, you'll find chapters on things such as states' rights, government's involvement in agriculture, taxes and spending, the welfare state, etc. And if you spend more than 5 seconds operating within the established paradigm of mainstream conservative dialogue, you know topics like these like the back of your hand. I know topics like these like the back of my hand, but I'll tell you something, and feel free to stop me if you can't relate. When I look outside and I see my city burning to the ground, when I see Black Lives Matter and Antifa rioters approaching my property, no police to be seen, telling my children that they should hate their country, that they should hate their ancestors simply because of the color of their skin, that they should question their gender identity before they're even old enough to be left home alone by themselves, when my neighbors have their jobs shipped overseas and they're being told that that's okay because they'll theoretically be able to buy orange juice for 30 cents less. Is that worth the dignity of being raped of the American dream? That's what they've been told. Or perhaps even more degrading, when they're actually forced to train the people that will replace them at the jobs that they've had for decades. This happens all the time. Or when my friends, they can't find women who don't have body counts in the double digits, who aren't taking SSRIs, who can't go 2 days without posting something on Instagram to derive external gratification from social media, or who aren't alcoholics who derive their entire personality from fast food and Netflix and drinking wine and thinking that's its own personality. personality, whatever. Or when my sister can't find a husband who's maybe not participating in his own enslavement to carnal desires, who's not pursuing general pathologies like escapism through drugs, video games, and pornography to keep the faith, who have a purpose greater than themselves, who recognize their role as a man in society. When I can't even give a speech to this very fine audience without having my life threatened by assemblies of dysgenic retards, you know what's on my mind? I'll tell you. I'm not thinking about federalism. I'm not thinking about the deficit. Believe it or not, I'm not even thinking about Ronald Reagan. What I'm much more focused on is the immediate realization that the solution to these problems is not a flat tax. The solution to these problems is not to abolish the Department of Agriculture. And as much as we hold these truths right now to be self-evident when we hear them, you wouldn't know such to be the case upon opening and reading through the manifesto or even operating within the established paradigm of modern conservative dialogue, which exists, of course, largely because of this manifesto. He even ends the introductory chapter by writing that there is no difficulty in the day's overriding political challenge being identified, which he writes is to preserve and extend freedom, and that the conservatives' first concern will always be, are we maximizing freedom? What even is freedom? What are these abstractions? What is liberty? What does that mean? Well, the aforementioned established paradigm will have you believe that they are synonymous, but they're actually not, because, of course, pre-modern understanding of liberty, whether that's in the Greco-Roman understanding as articulated by Plato, Aristotle or Cicero, or the Christian understanding as articulated by Augustine, Aquinas, or Dante, was not that an individual should be free to just do as they please, but rather that an individual must cultivate discipline and an education in order to pursue what is good. In other words, the founding thinkers of Western civilization rejected our current understanding of liberty, and they even regarded it to be a form of slavery. And it's a much more pernicious form of slavery because it's enslavement to oneself and to one's desires. But in the American conservative dialogue that we see so often now, they would disagree with that. They would tell you that liberty is the freedom to pursue your preferred method of self-destruction. Or that things like Drag Queen Story Hour, which is drag queens performing these very sexualized dances for children in taxpayer-funded libraries, well, those are just one of the many blessings of liberty, as people like David French would have us believe. We don't like David French. But as it would turn out, freedom is not an end in itself. It is simply a means to an end, a transitory phase. And given that man's nature is flawed, which the conservative claims to understand, solely emphasizing freedom as something to be pursued in itself would logically and inevitably result in the demoralization and the destruction of man, and resultantly his civilization. It's also important to note that Senator Goldwater emphasized the importance of not only maximizing freedom, but extending it as well. And this is the thinking that led us towards the Bush Doctrine of extending freedom to nations who have never had it and who never wanted it. And this was the ethos of neoconservatism, to provide freedom. And then neoliberalism basically clarified by just adding to be gay onto that. But they're more or less the same thing. But regardless, we were assured by the so-called expert class that we would be met with open arms, we would be celebrated, there would be parades, and of course none of that happened. Freedom and democracy did not actually flourish in the areas. In the Middle East, this is an ancient religious culture, and they really thought that they could be in there for 10, 20 years and get these people to start waving flags. It's not exactly that simple. We literally lost to guys driving Tacomas. They had old Soviet AKs. You almost have to respect it in a way. Speaking of boomer conservatives, we will go on a tangent here. They often, when you talk about the Second Amendment, they assume that that which is going to make the nation able to, fight off a hostile and illegitimate regime is more or less dependent on the type of arms to which they have access. So, we got 180 million guns in this country. I think it's actually 400 million guns in this country. And you look at the Taliban, what they have is will. They are not weak. And they had AKs and of course, there's that scene in Lord of War. We're going on jam. Okay, Nick Cage. But we have so many guns, and we just went through the greatest tyranny in the history of the world in this country, actually, except for maybe a handful of exceptions in the 20th century, and no one did anything about it. And this is not a call to violence, this is not incitement, it is simply to say that there has to be something more to drive the people than simply tools. There has to be this internalized willpower that this country is more or less lacking. And I think that's important to understand. But of course, none of that happened, and that experiment is still costing us money and people, both of which are being taken from American households, American families. And so how is it exactly that the traditional American society is conserved by robbing American families of their wealth and of their young boys and young girls now? Well, what is being conserved while they're doing that, when we're spreading gender theory to women and children in the Middle East? Nothing. But our leaders will insist that, well, they hate us because we're free. And that prompts us to sort of participate in what I refer to as this like George Bush era conservatism, which is like mounting American flags on lifted trucks, starting USA chants, watching American children have their genitals mutilated before being pumped with hormones, and assuring ourselves that the real barbaric society is over there in the Middle East. I'm not so sure about that, but much of this emphasis on freedom, like all political strategies, was manufactured and mass-marketed with preconceived ends in mind. So during the Cold War, America sought to defend itself against communism and more specifically leftist economics. And it did this by highlighting the very convenient reality that these countries that were experimenting with these policies were not able to do so without extreme authoritarianism and human rights violations. It was this Cold War era political strategy that cemented freedom and fiscal conservatism as the quintessential conservative talking points. So during the Cold War, America had to emphasize and perhaps even exaggerate how free it really was. But after the Cold War, we needed a purpose, right? The Soviet menace was supposedly defeated, freedom and capitalism had supposedly won, and so America needed a post-war objective. And so just as the Cold War had required an emphasis on freedom, the emphasis on freedom now required war to be perpetual within the post-war American imperative. And as much as we may be inclined to naively believe that we're the top dog because we're like just that good, that's kind of circular reasoning, isn't it? The reason that America is the last remaining superpower from the 20th century is because we avoided the two world wars longer than the other countries did, and then we avoided a war with the USSR, which would have done more damage to our country than even was done to Britain during World Wars I and II. And with this, we're reminded of a celebrated historian by the name of A.G.P. Taylor, who wrote extensively about British history. And he said that though the object of being a great power is to be able to fight a great war, the only way of remaining a great power is to not fight one. The United States is a great power. We've been a great power for a very long time, but we will not be a great power within the next few decades, or even years, actually, considering what's going on now, if we continue down this path, because we have taken for granted all of what made America great. And because of that, there's no reason to suggest that it will remain great. And this is the fundamental problem with neoconservatism. Freedom turned out to just mean moral and social degradation, and free markets turned out to just mean jobs being shipped overseas and companies lobbying to open up our borders so that mass immigrants could come here from the third world in the name of cheap labor. Because it turns out that America is not actually the natural state of the world. Like all great civilizations, America is impermanent. And all that made America great, we've unfortunately found out, was impermanent as well. So the neoconservative and post-war emphasis on freedom, on capitalism, on small government, all the adjacent bumper sticker talking points being not only the defining features of conservatism, but the only ones that are allowed to exist within the approved paradigm, that's turned out to be a failure. The traditional American society has not been conserved. The moral fabric of the nation has not been conserved because it's not to be taken for granted. The family structure of a nation is not to be taken for granted. The ethos of a society, the logos of a society is not to be taken for granted. And interestingly enough, it is those very facets of the society that compose its foundation. Without that foundation, your society is doomed to fail. Because at that point, it doesn't even exist. There's nothing under which to unify. You're all simply consumers who feel as though you have freedom because the screen people tell you so, and you can watch porn and buy guns, and so that's why Washington crossed the Delaware. I don't know about that. But the point being that neoconservatism, which by the way, historically, as we know, was just founded by disaffected liberals who didn't quite like socialism, but who did like bombing foreign countries. That's been a failure. And anybody who at this point, given the state of the country, is still trying to sell it to you, doesn't view you as a fellow American, but as a consumer waiting to be exploited. Do not be fooled. And to reiterate, this is not to say that the principles as outlined in the manifesto are in themselves bad. They're not. But it is to say that social conservatism is the prerequisite to fiscal conservatism. In other words, if you don't conserve the social and moral fabric of the nation, you will not have a nation left in which to establish those free markets that you cherish. Without conserving the social and moral fabric of the nation, your free markets will devolve from lemonade stands to OnlyFans. And we don't like that. Because capitalism is just a machine, right? It's this amoral abstraction. And without a moral fabric in society, that machine will deviate from providing to you appliances and furniture at a low cost efficiently to eventually enabling people to profit off getting your children addicted to pornography, addicted to marijuana, any one of the many vices designed to pacify and depress people. And without a social fabric in the society, that society will eventually destabilize to where it requires that big government that we fear so much in order to prevent, but more realistically just delay, its collapse. I'm assuming that much of this is ringing a bell. To repeat, fiscal conservatism is a means to an end. I want to be able to keep more of my money so that I can provide to my family, provide for my family. I want to be able to purchase goods that we require. I want to be able to do that for as little cost as possible. Small government, that is also a means to an end. I want to be able to pursue good as defined by God without the government breathing down my neck, and I want to be able to provide for my family without some bureaucrat taking my money, telling me how to run my business. It's like this extortive consultation service, except you can't say no because then they'll shoot your dog. But all of these principles, they are just simply means to ends. They're not ends in themselves. They serve a purpose. And when that purpose is forgotten, or when it's taken for granted, we can't expect it to self-perpetuate. Conservatism, properly defined, is simply that which conserves the traditional American society. But instead of actively working towards that end, which would require effort, we've elected to work towards these abstract means in themselves, which was astroturfed, by the way, by transnational corporations, the ruling class, basically all the people who you know more or less hate you and want to destroy you. So I don't think anyone in this room feels as though we're really winning, as though you're scoring points, especially when you do things like, hey Lib, socialism sucks. Hey AOC, I'm going to technically troll you on Twitter. These are not actually viable political strategies. This is why there was an unprecedented and tremendous pushback against President Trump, because he broke free from that post-war neoliberal consensus, and all the aforementioned actors were acting, of course, in bad faith, knew that they had to stop it, because that has been the only legitimate threat to their power and resultantly to the established paradigm that has existed for the American people in the last 80 years. But unfortunately for us, these privatized propaganda apparatuses that have assembled to serve as an extension of these power structures under the name of freedom and free markets and whatever, they've indoctrinated the country into not only believing that it's permissible, but righteous to punish someone for being socially conservative, formerly known as actually conservative. If you want to conserve the American family by rejecting feminism and the sexual revolution, you will be attacked. If you want to conserve the American culture by, I don't know, maybe proposing that bringing in like 2 million people a year might be a tad bit excessive, you will be attacked. In other words, if you actually want to conserve something beyond these abstract principles, you will be attacked. These abstract principles that have been proven over the course of several decades to be indisputably inadequate in themselves at the task of actually conserving the country, you will be attacked. And that's actually a good thing. If the worst people in society, the people who kill babies, the people who desecrate the legacies of the men who built this country, the people who want to sexualize your children, if they're not attacking you, then it either means that they view you to be an ally or they do not view you to be a threat. In either case, fix yourself. Conserve something or lose everything. We will make America great again. Thank you. Well, thank you all for being here today. I hope you've enjoyed the event.